1 day before the project agreement was signed, financing was removed as a responsibility of the private vendor in the amendments to the master agreement, which had been signed 9 months earlier. Now, presently, private equity represents approximately 1% of the project financing. Furthermore, the financing structure backed by the contract signed by former administration ties the state's credit rating to this project, and that's part of the major issue of concern. Now, there are additional changes pointed out in the report that are also significant. They include the Commonwealth is making so-called availability payments before the network is available. Proposals of a fixed-price, date-certain project have obviously not panned out. Now, the effect of these changes gives the private sector less incentive to monitor and deliver the project on time and on budget. Now, when we ask ourselves whether current problems could have been avoided, the answer is yes, based on the evidence. Now, at least 3 months prior to the project agreement, Kentucky Department of Education officials warned the Finance Cabinet in 2015 that the new network would not be E-rate eligible. Project funding relied on a plan to transition government internet services, including K-12 schools, to KentuckyWired network and charge for these services. The majority of K-12 internet service costs are reimbursed through a federal program called E-rate. Part of qualifying for E-rate is that the services be bid in a competitive manner. Now, in addition to pointing out that KentuckyWired would not be E-rate eligible, KDE also expressed concerns about transitioning to a new, unproven network. Now, despite these warnings, the Finance Cabinet signed a project agreement and moved forward with an RFP for K-12 internet services. Now, as KDE officially predicted, the RFP was challenged based on alleged conflicts of interest. As a result, there is no current plan. Let me repeat that. There is no current plan to transfer K-12 schools to KentuckyWired. This funding gap is crippling to the project's plan to pay for itself. K-12 schools represents 45% of the needed projected revenues over a 30-year period. Now, the graph on display shows the difference needed from the general fund or some other source each year to make up for this shortfall. Now, another warning the Commonwealth officials received prior to signing the project agreement was the potential for pole attachment problems. Not only did the Commonwealth move forward, but state officials agreed to assume responsibility for pole attachments by changing the terms of the RFP, as we discussed previously. Now, in addition, estimates of poles needed from certain companies were wildly inaccurate. Originally, planners estimated they only needed 5,000 poles owned by AT&T. However, when in reality, they needed 12,000 poles. Also, planners initially thought they only needed 750 poles owned by Windstream, when in reality, they needed nearly 8,000 poles. Now, when we asked KCNA who provided the inaccurate pole counts, they pointed to the private contractors. Now, when we looked at the project agreement, the responsibility for pole counts was expressly stated as a joint responsibility of the Commonwealth. This was consistent with most of the terms of the contracts we examined, with risk minimized for private vendors and placed on the Commonwealth in key areas. Claims related to pole attachment agreements are part of the basis for the $88 million settlement memorandum the Commonwealth signed earlier this year. Now, this memorandum is tentative, with the details still being negotiated past an agreed-upon initial deadline of July 6, 2018. As indicated earlier, it is important to note that the $24 million in contractor claims for easements are not resolved. They are not part of this settlement. The settlement will not resolve future supervening event claims which are possible under the construction contract and the service contract after construction. The Commonwealth has already authorized up to $22 million in additional borrowing beyond that $88 million for plans for future cost overruns. Now, the revenue plan for Kentucky Wired is made up of two parts. Now, the first part I discussed previously. The plan is for government sites to use Kentucky Wired Network and pay Kentucky Wired instead of other outside providers. The government sites are intended to pay for the $1.17 billion in availability payments related to the network. However, as we discussed, K through 12 is 45% of that revenue and is now missing. Actually, all of this revenue is missing until the network is operational, further complicating this plan to make Kentucky Wired self-funding. Now, the second side of the revenue is the wholesale revenue. The revenue model for wholesale calls for fees to increase each year by 2.5%. Now, certainly this does not seem logical. Prices should be driven down by more competition, not increased year over year. The revenue projections for the wholesale being relied upon were described as conceptual to our auditors. Now, the plan calls for an optimistic $1.3 billion to the Commonwealth over 30 years. These projections are optimistic because of these and other issues identified in our report. Now, project agreements specifically disclaim that the Commonwealth should not rely on the projections and the assumptions behind the projections. Private vendors confirmed that their efforts to generate wholesale business was in their discretion and based on profitability. This structure is a huge concern for a network that is being touted as a driver of economic development in underserved areas. Now, the contract states that the vendor is not required to undertake economic development initiatives. Rather, the Commonwealth may pay additional cost in the future for these initiatives if the vendor declines. Finally, some portion of the $1.3 billion expected revenue, if realized, will be shared with the Center for Rural Development. Now, there are additional or unplanned costs related to Kentucky Wired that will either be paid from the general fund or from the wholesale revenues. Now, plans estimate that a minimum of two network refreshes will cost $87 million total, occurring every 10 years over the 30-year period. However, contracts suggest refreshes may be needed as often as every 3 years, kind of about the time frame that I update my phone, about every 3 years now. This cost is merely an estimate. Now, the K through 12 schools funding gap previously discussed, if not paid for out of general funds, would cost $539 million from wholesale revenues. The $110 million authorized borrowing for settlement and new supervening events, plus interest on this amount, could be repaid from the wholesale revenues, or it would have to be paid from the general fund. Wholesale revenue, if it materializes, may need to cover additional significant unknown or unresolved costs, such as liability for other supervening events, economic development, or repayment of general fund appropriations made this past session. In summary, whatever wholesale revenue might be created is no longer a bonus, unfortunately, to the Commonwealth. It is now an essential part of the project funding. The Commonwealth is now responsible for when I say Commonwealth, I mean the taxpayers. The Commonwealth is now responsible for 93% of the project cost, totaling $1.5 billion over 30 years. This occurred without legislative authorization and was sold as a $30 million investment from taxpayers, with the private sector bearing most of the risk. Because of this discovery, our examination of procurement will continue. We will look further into extending procurement and negotiation that took place between 2014 and 2015, and that's basically between the time that the RFP and response put all the risk, or the majority of the risk, as well as the investments in the private sector, and the final project inking of the project agreement that basically placed it on the taxpayers. Now, the key question is, who authorized significant project changes and placed the Commonwealth in this position? Now, as it stands, we continue to pay the cost for projects without seeing any of the benefits. The current structure is certainly not working. Now, I wish I had better news as I started off. I wish our examination revealed that there is confidence of completing the network soon and realizing benefits from KentuckyWired. However, in almost every aspect of this project, we saw an example of how not to set up a public-private partnership. If nothing else, future projects of this magnitude and commitment required greater transparency, greater oversight from the legislature, and frankly, just better decisions. Thank you for inviting me here to discuss the results of our work, and certainly at this time I would be happy to answer any questions or for more of the technical details I have staff available that can answer those as well.
Auditor Harmon, thank you for your presentation, and I'll kick it off with a couple questions. When the financing you said was removed as a vendor responsibility one day before the project agreement was signed, through your review, did you get were there any fiscal issues that led to that? Did you come across any documentation that explained why that change was made at the last minute?
Our auditors may speak to that, but it's my understanding that there was a belief that they could save additional funds if they went to tax-free bonds. Chris, if you'd like to go into more detail. Or
yeah, there are several agreements at play, and the one mentioned that was one day prior to the project agreement was they called it a master agreement, entered into in December of 2014. And between December of 2014 and September of 2015, you have these negotiations taking place, resulting in the creation of an entity called QWIC, KentuckyWired Infrastructure Company, that was a vehicle to have tax-exempt bonds rather than the private sector obtaining financing by having their own bonding. So we were told that the reason that change took place, in theory, was that tax-exempt bonds would be cheaper than bonds in the private sector. However, that's what ties all this to the state's credit rating.
And it transfers the risk, both in that as well as the poll attachments. It's kind of like if you ever look at investments, you know, if someone just tells you, you can get 18% or you get 3% and they don't describe the risk, well, you're going to take the 18%, but if you factor in the risk, that 18% might actually be a negative 100%.
And what you're saying kind of goes back to the fact that the contract was actually signed while the negotiations continued.
It's a unorthodox procurement in that you have over a year of a procurement process, and there's actually an award of a contract and then a subsequent contract that changes the terms. And one thing to keep in mind here is this all occurred as a P3 before there was any P3 legislation in Kentucky. So, I don't understand why they did it that way, but you have a contract, an award, and then negotiations after that award.
And part of what we discussed as well is if other vendors had known that they were going to shift this type of design, there might have been additional bids to the RFP. So, I mean, in my personal opinion, I think they should have, when they changed it this significantly, they should have gone back and rebid it if they were going to go this direction.
I think our P3 ended up being a P1, and the P1 is on the taxpayers' shoulders.
I think someone else described the P1 as pain, so.
I can understand that.
Yes.
The part that you talked about where wholesale revenue would be shared with the Center for Rural Development, is that in the contract, or how did that come to be, and how binding is that?
That's an agreement. It's a memorandum of agreement that is an appendix to the report. It's produced in full there. And that's an agreement between the Commonwealth of Kentucky and the Center for Rural Development. There's an addendum to that agreement also in the report stating what the revenue share will be along certain segments of the network along I-75 and in eastern Kentucky. As to how binding that is, that's not for our office to say. That's an agreement that was signed like the other agreement mentioned by a finance cabinet official in 2015, and that's the document that we've been provided.
Okay. Thank you. Representative Rothenberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Auditor Harmon, and I know it's still kind of hard for me because I worked with you on several pieces of legislation when you were state representative. I think one of the most troubling pieces of the puzzle that I have a hard time digesting is how any one person can have the authority to indebt the Commonwealth of Kentucky to this magnitude. And from your opinion, both the state auditor and as former state representative, what safeguards are in place or can we put in place to make sure that this never happens again in the future?
Well, as of right now, I would say there's probably not a ton of safeguards in place. However, I will say that it's my understanding, and someone can speak to differ, that in the most recent P3 legislation, there was some minor safeguard, well, major safeguards, but safeguards that they don't go into effect, if I understand, 2020, if I remember correctly, that basically would cap anything beyond 25 million commitment. That's still a lot, but it's not 1.5 billion, but 25 million would have to come to the General Assembly for passage. So from that aspect, that is thankfully a better safeguard that's put in place.
Well, and I think you can agree to this, that the state legislature has done a good job in the past making sure that state and local governments don't, that broad power doesn't continue on them, so they can go up to a certain point before their legislative bodies have to become fully aware and agree to that. And it's just ironic that they pass laws for local government, but not for themselves. And I think it's time that we take a look at that on our level to once again build those safeguards in to make sure that any future generations are indebted at this point. So.
Right, and there have been in the past some discussions about separation of powers and things along that lines. I know one of the things that we looked at, certainly there was an opportunity, not necessarily to stop this, but to maybe shine the light on it a little bit more with the committee meeting, and unfortunately that particular committee meeting was canceled prior to it, and perhaps we need, not perhaps, we definitely need better oversight on these projects from the General Assembly.
Yeah, and this, Mr. Chairman, just real quickly, I know that from my experience here for the last 2 years, there are some very talented legislators here that sits in both chambers, both on both sides of the aisle, and I feel confident that if this legislation would have came to the legislators, that this piece of legislation or this contract would have not moved forward because of all the talent that we have on both sides of the aisle to safeguard us at this point. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity.
And may I comment as
Yes,
well?
sir, please.
I think if the original format, where basically Macquarie was taking on the responsibility of securing the private investors and Macquarie was taking on the responsibility of the pole attachments, if they had stayed in the original format of the RFP and the response, I think the General Assembly, including myself, would have been very supportive of that particular avenue. But to be able to change it, or as I say, flip the script, you know, without having any oversight at all, I mean, that's just horrendous. It's just horrendous. Thank you.
Senator Sy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always a pleasure to work with you, Auditor Harmon. I'm not sure I know how to ask this question, so I'll just kind of, you know, back in the real world, when I was doing some financing and building a few houses, there was this thing called we put the money in a escrow account. Now, you used the term in your presentation of missing money. I think you said that. Was this pot of money drawn down as necessary, and was there oversight as to where it's being spent?
Well, I think, and of course I can let our auditor speak more detail, but my understanding is one of the findings of our report is there needed to be additional oversight and monitoring from KCNA, but I can let our
I think the missing money may be referring to the funding gap with the loss of the K through 12 contract. But you're right, and I've described it like you have. You know, if you're building a house, then after you get to a certain point of construction, you make a payment, and then after the
you have to actually spend the money where you're supposed to spend it. That's.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the issue so much as the original proposal stated that the Commonwealth would not pay for this project until it was completed and accepted and ready. What we've ended up doing is we are making a stream of payments rather than milestone payments throughout the project, and we've been doing that even though we don't have a network yet, and continue to.
So, and there was no oversight over that, is that my understanding?
There was insufficient oversight.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator West?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Auditor Harmon, for
Always
this
good.
report. It's a very detailed report.
Yes.
Makes your head spin a little bit reading through it. But
Looking at the charts of all the companies and sub-companies
yes,
that were created, certainly.
yes. I'm going to draw your attention specifically, narrow it down a little bit, to page 19 of the overall report. Yes. And if you don't have it, that's fine. But I'm going to read kind of what you put into the report. Basically, you state here that you ask the question, were the problems with KentuckyWired foreseeable? And then you answer your own question, and you basically say, yes, they were foreseeable.
3 times.
We had attorneys representing the Commonwealth that were supposed to protect us against these foreseeable events. In this process, did you happen to talk to any of those outside attorneys that represented the Commonwealth?
Sure. Chris?
We have not spoken to the outside attorneys. There is at least one attorney internally that is part of our interviews going on. One of those 3 warnings that Auditor Harmon mentioned that you referred to in that report was an outside counsel letter. Of course, there are attorney-client privileges issues there that would prevent us from seeing some of that information.
Sure, which leads to my next question. In bullet point 3, it says Commonwealth officials were given written advice by outside counsel, the full extent, which is still unknown, due to a claim of attorney-client privilege. Okay, so we can't see that information today because of attorney-client privilege. My question is, in this case, who is the client?
It's a very good question. That email was discussed with us, and so we have provided the information to the extent it was given to us about the email. We asked for the document, and the agency, KCNA, made a claim of attorney-client privilege not to provide that document. As far as who the client is, I may have to write a law review article on that
Sure.
to get to that point.
Because of the graphs and whatnot, exactly. But obviously, the state of Kentucky is the client. So at some point, someone within the state of Kentucky, some entity, has the right to see that opinion and that information.
I agree.
And if we're unable to see that information, maybe the only way we end up seeing it is a malpractice claim against the firm through the discovery process. But somehow I think the people of Kentucky need to see what advice was given to the Commonwealth by those outside attorneys who were supposed to advise us and protect us against unforeseen circumstances. Page 20 of the report, once again I'm going to read it. It's at the very bottom. It says, what can be done to prevent problems like this in future projects? Formal risk assessment in developing contract terms, including the use of Commonwealth agency expertise and outside expertise where needed. Any experts retained should be acting in the Commonwealth's interest without interests that may conflict with the Commonwealth's. So to me that kind of begged the question. It kind of implied that some of the experts representing the Commonwealth may have had a conflict of interest. Specifically, could you speak on that and tell the committee what you think? Who in particular are you talking about?
The conflict, and Josh, you may help me out with this, but conflict of interest is a term of art, so I don't want to say that except
Sure.
Small c, small I conflict of interest. But there were certainly, the way this was set up originally with Macquarie has been the name of the primary vendor. They were to be a broker of sorts and bring other private entities to the table. Some of those private entities were the consultants who prepared the revenue projections, and then even the parties brought in outside had consultants of their own. So there's sub down the chain. But those entities at that point are working for Macquarie. They are hired by Macquarie, the private vendor. A lot of the costs paid at financial close are There is counsel for the Commonwealth. Commonwealth has its own counsel, obviously, internally. But there are a lot of private counsel that we, as the Commonwealth, paid the cost for to advise these private vendors, who also, by the way, were responsible for drafting all of the contracts that have caused these problems. So those are a few of examples.
Could you stop there for a second? So are you saying that the state of Kentucky was paying the counsel for Macquarie to draft the contract, which was actually had more favorable terms for Macquarie?
That's what it appears to me. And I think, in fairness, we would normally pay those costs through the price of a contract anyway,
Sure.
But here they were actually broken out as separate costs.
Okay. I guess this is specifically for Auditor Harmon. And last time we had Secretary Landerman in to speak on this topic, and this is the thing that jumps out at me, and I asked him the specific question: in all your years in the legislature, in all your years doing this type of work, your work as an auditor, have you ever heard of a government contract being issued before the negotiations were complete on the contract?
I personally have not, and of this magnitude, I have not.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Co-Chair Beckler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have a couple comments, one in general and one specific, and then I have some questions. I did find it interesting that when you were talking about the revenue sharing with the Center for Rural Development, you specifically mentioned Eastern Kentucky and Lexington, but as per usual, nothing was ever said about Western Kentucky. And I think we're getting the short end far too often. That's just a general comment. My other comment is, as you know, I'm not an attorney, and I don't play one on television, but I find it hard to believe that you can have attorney-client privilege when the client is not an individual. I've spoken to some folks who share that, so I'm not comfortable that we aren't going forward and fighting that. I don't believe there is attorney-client privilege in that case. Now to my questions. In your review, did you find out why the Oversight Committee meeting was actually canceled?
I don't think we had any documentation as to why it was canceled, did we? Just that we had notification that it was canceled.
But you didn't ask why? In your investigation, that question was not raised?
Sure.
The question wasn't raised because the statute specifically allows for that committee meeting to be canceled by the co-chairs. There was a letter to that effect, and actually, as pointed out in the report, that committee's decision with regard to issuance of the bonds is non-binding. The Secretary of Finance can override any decision they make, even if they had met.
Yeah, I understand, but since it happened so quickly, I still think it would have been a good question to ask and would have been another nail in the coffin of why the contract was signed. Do you have any estimate as to how long it will be before assuming we go forward, and I'm not sure that's a good assumption, before before it's up and running?
Well, I know in the project settlement that they were looking at, they were projecting 2020, but that has not actually been finalized. And so, and I know the contractors initially were looking at, well, not initially, but before the negotiations for the project settlement, I think it was 2022, if I remember correctly. But for the settlement agreement, they were hoping to get it 2020.
No one knows the answer to that question.
Yes.
I don't think anyone can give a reasonable answer to that question. The new proposed date of 2020 is in what is, as of right now, a tentative agreement that's not really finalized. And even if that is finalized, the date of 2020 is subject to further supervening events. Those are not excluded under the settlement going forward.
Right. So I guess my cynicism about any projected date in my lifetime may be
may be well taken. How long would you estimate after the entire project is complete before the state would ever break even? How many years?
That's really tough to estimate, just from the standpoint of, the charts over here show whether we have what we call it surpluses, but really it's all deficits, but with the exception of two, that if we had the E-rate, if we actually got that.
But we know we're not going to get that.
That we're probably not going to get. So you can see all the deficits here. I don't know. It would be difficult because all the revenues we have been told are speculative in nature.
With all the
and with the refreshes.
I was going to say, with the refreshes, it seems to me that it would be a reasonable assumption to make that we'll never break even. Chris, I think I interrupted you.
That's fine. Again, on the revenue side, so the cost that we have, the $1.5 billion conservative cost projection, that's the closest thing we can put our hands on. And that's just the number we can put our hands on. We know it's going to be higher than that, but we can't give a number higher than that. On the revenue side, as Auditor Harmon said in his opening remarks, we have no idea. And until the network is operational, there is no revenue anyway. So as far as a break-even point, it largely depends on, first of all, when the network is completed before we could even attempt to generate revenue. And that's something we can't answer.
I understand, Walt. What would, I believe you indicated, Auditor Harmon, that we are continuing to make payments.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say what we call non-availability payments. It's supposed to be availability payments, but it's for a network that's not actually available.
All right, and typically those payments would be made once the project was complete. What would happen if we just stopped making, in your estimation, I know I'm asking for a lot of estimates, if we just stopped making those until the project was complete?
Well, one of the things that we did list, there are a couple of options to depart from this particular one, especially if there was a decision made that there wasn't the ability to move forward, at least in the current format. One of those was funding out. Now, those bonds, even though they have a moral obligation, we have a moral obligation because it would impact our bond rating. Technically, we do not have a full, I don't know if I want to use the term legal obligation, but in those bond documents, they do say that it is subject to future appropriations. So if the General Assembly chose not to appropriate it, then those payments would stop being made. As a matter of fact, those of you all who look at your Constitution, which I know everyone here does, the general fund appropriation, the general bond, you can only issue up to $500,000, and the way they get around that is with these revenue bonds. And so certainly that funding out would be one option. Now we have kind of said that if you're going to go that route, then you need to figure out, because the funding out would eliminate you still have lawsuits, but would eliminate the project agreement, would eliminate a lot of it, but you still need to figure out a way to hopefully pay for the bonds, just pay for the bonds and not all the other stuff. And I've even suggested that maybe we need to look at, if they can't get this new agreement signed or inked, maybe they need to look at doing a new RFP, or with the new P3 legislation, if an AT&T or a Windstream wants to come up and say, you know what, we see you guys messed up, we'll buy you out at 50 cents on the dollar or whatever, and we'll take over the liability and the bonding. Certainly that might be an option as well. But in the current format, it is being more and more suspect as to whether it will be completed.
Like you, I do believe there are going to be lawsuits regardless of what happens, whether we continue down the path we're going or whether we just stop. And on a personal note, I think I'm on record, but I'll go on record now. I think we ought to just stop the whole project and then try and get going as to how any of the lawsuits. I really don't believe that the Commonwealth would be in worse shape by doing that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Koenig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Auditor Harmon, and thank you for doing this, and the staff for doing such a great job. This was an exhilarating read. I can only imagine how much fun it was to put together. So you all did a great job, and I appreciate that. I have a few questions, and some of them may not may be easy to answer, but for someone not as knowledgeable for me, bear with me. On page 15, I think you kind of answered the this question at the top of page 15 about the dates. We have, these are tentative dates, and what certainty did we or did we not have of those dates of final construction in July 2020 being good? Do we know?
Well, the auditors can speak more in detail, but my understanding is that's part of the negotiations. There was an additional $2 million good faith payment made when they were entering into this particular agreement while they were negotiating it, and apparently it wasn't as good faith as they had hoped, and they have not. So they have not inked that agreement. You can speak a little bit more, Chris or Josh, if you want to, but that's as of now, it's not good at all because they haven't finalized the agreement.
On the next page, page 16, under the section, can sections of the network be brought online before the entire project is completed? What I got from reading that paragraph was that there are sections, including the section in my part of the world, that is complete and ready to go and is not being utilized. Did I get that right, and can you explain to me why that is?
I don't know that that's the case. The map on the prior page, page 15, shows construction status, and it looks like there is more completion in northern Kentucky. However, an entire ring, or you have to draw a circle somehow along that segment. My understanding is the entire ring would have to be operational before even that part could be utilized, and it doesn't look like that's the case at this point.
Do we know why the entire ring has to be completed? Because I just see revenue opportunities not being utilized.
As to why any particular ring on the map is not completed, that's sort of the question that has us all here. And so I don't know what the particular construction issues may or may not be in any segment.
Well, for the chairman and the staff, if we could find out if that's a legit answer.
Mr. Chairman, can I comment just a little bit on that? Representative, I would also say that, and just as I said earlier, if we chose the funding out method, I certainly think if you were doing a new RFP, you could certainly allow that. Matter of fact, when they first bid this, and Macquarie bid on it, there were some of the vendors, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the vendors actually suggested that they do it ring by ring as opposed to the whole thing, and that was rejected. Is that correct? It
was not addressed in the response to the question.
Not addressed in the response to the question.
Well, I mean, maybe someone smarter than us can get us the answer to that, why we can't get the infrastructure that's currently existing moving and generating some revenue. I mean, by the time it's ready, it might need a refresh by then, for gosh sakes.
The construction questions would be more appropriately directed at KCNA, the agency overseeing this. I don't think I could come up with a informed answer for you on that.
Yeah. Okay. On page 25, I think that was the first of many places where it stated that Macquarie was not in business anymore. Can someone explain to me the legality of having to maintain a contract with a non-existent entity?
Well, and I don't know if Josh, if you want to speak to this, but my understanding is they technically are not here in their original capacity. However, they are partners in some of the other ones, if that's correct.
Yes, they continue to be a partner as far as the wholesaler once the network goes live. The plan will be for that business to be a wholly owned entity of Macquarie, so they still have a relationship with the Commonwealth in that respect, but that particular passage in the report is referring to the project construction, the availability payments we'll make during that period, and also the availability payments we'll make once the network is live. That is the part of the project that they are attesting that they are no longer a part of.
Yeah, and that's, they're part of the construction, and we're in the middle of construction, and they don't exist anymore. And so maybe that's something an attorney can look into.
Correct me if I'm wrong, they still exist, they just don't exist in Kentucky.
Yeah, the quote in the report is
So-
when the state reached out to them to recertify compliance after this contract was entered into, they said we are no longer doing business in the state of Kentucky, and that was Macquarie up on high versus the various Macquarie entities or subsidiaries who are still involved in this arrangement over here.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, metaphysically, they don't exist then. On page 42, it talks about Macquarie's interest in attempts to generate private funding. Is there any belief or possibility that Macquarie figured out that they couldn't raise funding for this because they realized it was going to be so expensive, and that's
That is
perhaps why we're in the
probably
situation
part,
we're
as
in?
indicated, we are continuing reviewing. We felt like it was necessary for us to get this out as soon as possible because this committee, as others, are looking at this project and trying to determine what path to move forward. However, we are continuing our review of the procurement phase, so that may or may not be something that we determine as we review the additional review of the procurement phase.
I would like to thank you for pointing out issues on page 82 about the wholesale pricing. There's been a lot of talk about not being able to generate revenue from the K through 12, which just seems like it's, when we're charging K through 12, it's like taking money out of one of our pockets and putting it in the other. But that notwithstanding, there's not been much coverage as to the wholesale price and the 2.5% increase, and so I appreciate you pointing that out. And this is just a general question for anyone, you all or anyone else. Is there a way to determine when this is built out, what the value of the infrastructure would be? Because if we need to go through all this, I think one of our options should be to build it out and then sell it and take what we can get and get out.
I think that would be at this moment difficult to assess, just from the standpoint, because we've talked about the problems, that the original estimates were speculative in nature. So anything that we could do would probably be, speculative in nature as well. Certainly, at a minimum, you'd have your hardware. I'm not sure that it would certainly be worth something, but I think it would be difficult to assign a true value to it.
And I'm sure it would be, but I would love it if someone, whether it be our staff here or someone from the executive branch of your office, would give it a try and talking with the private sector folks. And lastly, one comment, if I could, Mr. Chairman, I know I've gone on. When you read this report, and I made this comment, somebody before the meeting, you wonder if it'd be an easier report to talk about what went, if anything was done right, because it would be a very short report. And it makes me come up with only 3 options that could lead us here, which is A, gross incompetence, B, a complete and total disregard for the taxpayers, or C, something much more nefarious. And it's sad to say, gee, I hope it's A or B, that we're here and staring at $1.5 billion we don't have that could be put to much better uses. And so I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Auditor Harmon.
Thank you.
Philip, are there any of the questions that he brought up, Philip Brown, any of the questions that you would like to address? And I hate to put you on the hot seat, but you've been on the hot seat for months now, and I'm sure you're used to it. The main question about the network, the loops being able to be put online before the system is complete, and the reality of that and the possibilities of that happening.
So for the record, Philip Brown, Executive Director of KCNA. I think to the auditor's report, the agency is digesting and preparing a response within the timeline that we have to put together a full, comprehensive digesting of everything in the report. I don't think that any of the problems noted in the report were surprises. Certainly problems that we've identified and been working to address. Certainly the project has issues. With regards to your question about the network and the possibility of lighting it, the thing that would hold us from lighting the Northern Kentucky section, which was built by Cincinnati Bell, is that until we have the Commonwealth Data Center here in Frankfort connected, and they are able to turn that on, we can't provide service to any of the sites that are in Northern Kentucky. And so we really have to get Northern Kentucky to Frankfort, either through the southern part of 1A, through Lexington, or the southwestern piece of it on the way to Louisville, all the way completed before we can light sites. But it is possible to light parts of the network prior to full ring closure. The only thing that the network wouldn't have in that scenario is redundancy. But as we have discussed internally, and I believe talked about in various committee meetings, at this point, none of the sites today have redundancy, and so we wouldn't be taking away something that those sites have if we migrated them early. But the benefits, of course, would be early site revenue that we would realize. And so as soon as we could light a site, we fully intend to do that. But we do have to have Frankfort to Louisville and Frankfort to Northern Kentucky connected in order to make that a reality.
Thank you, Philip. Appreciate that. Senator Thomas. Why don't, Philip, if you don't care, why don't you just stay up front here? We may need you again.
Sure.
Thank you, Chairman Carroll, and I have a couple of questions for Auditor Harmon. Auditor Harmon, I thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Auditor Harmon, I've made it clear that I think this is a worthwhile project. I think if Kentucky has any serious intention of joining the 21st century and advancing both commercially, educationally, and medically, we need to have this broadband highway. I don't see any other way for us to really be successful without it. I have asked for months, since we've been on this issue for months, as to what the final cost would be to finish this project. Secretary Landrum has been already indicated, was here last month, and he indicated that if you add in the $88 million for the settlement debt, plus the $22 million to cover intervening events that we have to pay for, that with additional $365 million, he was approximating here, over and above that would complete this project, which is about $475 million. Now, when you first were present at testimony, you said you didn't have any idea as to what the cost would be. In your opinion, is that $475 million estimate by Secretary Landrum fair? Do you think it's too low, or do you think it's too high?
Well, I think part of the problem is we haven't even settled the supervening events that were previously discussed. Now, there is information out there, there is funding available, but we haven't completed that, the settlement of that. The other thing is there's also $24.6 million in easement supervening events that we don't know. So it is difficult to assign an exact cost. And right now the state is, as we indicated, making availability payments for a network that's not available, and we assign those into the cost as well. If you look in our report, Senator, we have a detailed listing of cost as of to date and projections in the future, and there's several items in there that we just can't quantify, but just the availability payments equate to, I think it's $1.17 billion. So that's a large portion of the $5 billion. And part of that's the interest, obviously, on the bonding that's there.
My other question relates to your conversation with Representative Beckler. As you probably are very familiar with Auditor Harmon, every bond indenture that we have here in the Commonwealth has language to the effect that revenues will be provided to the extent that they are appropriated by the Commonwealth. That's in every bond indenture. I want to be clear in what you were saying. I certainly would have to believe that you're not saying that this Commonwealth would use that language in any bond indenture where we appropriated money to say that we're not going to appropriate money for any bond that we've obligated ourselves in the future, and therefore default on those bonds. I want to be clear that you're not recommending that we use that language with regard to this bond or any bond indenture not to fund our bonds.
Yeah, I think, Senator, that what I had mentioned earlier as well, we were looking at different options. One of those options was funding out. Technically, you could. I've actually said that I don't think that's good. I think from the standpoint, if you use the funding out option, you find a way to fund out of the project agreement, which has many of these other problems, but still find a way to go ahead and pay that bond. What I'm saying and what I had said earlier was the problem with flipping that script and going from all of it resting on the private sector, which would not obligate that to the Commonwealth. It would not be Commonwealth-backed debt. When we did that, it put us on the hook. Maybe, it definitely put us on the hook morally, because morally, we obligated ourselves to it, and if we were to default, which technically we could, but if we did, it would destroy our bond rating and would make it very difficult moving forward if we wanted to do any additional bonding.
I just want to make sure I understood you, because I agree with your very last statement, that we would not want to impact our bond rating in the state under any circumstances by using that language to default on a bond. That's my question, Senator Chairman Carroll.
Thank you, Senator Buford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing, maybe you could give it to us later. If we shut down, full case scenario, and maybe you could send that to us later, what would our debt service be for the bond that we have, I guess, based on 4.5% or 5%, if we just get over? Now, I know we're going to get into lawsuits and all of that thing.
Right.
But my guess is, I don't think there's any P3 in their right mind would touch this.
Right.
And I don't think Windstream, any of them, AT&T, I don't think you could give it to them. I don't think you could pay them to take this mess, in my personal opinion. I'd bet $2.87 if we offered it free tomorrow, and they would assume all the obligations that go with it, you wouldn't find one person step up that really had an IQ of over 50 that would want to get involved in this disaster that has been created.
And Senator, I don't have the exact cost, but
that's why I'm asking.
But it is several hundred millions of dollars.
Yes, I'd say we're probably $700 or $800 million, and I would say once we complete this, you will never be able to charge a fee that would ever debt service this in the life of anyone sitting in this room, and probably those that are not born yet in some degree. You can't charge that much. By the time this is completed, or we talk about selling the equipment off after we settle the lawsuits, that equipment will be so obsolete, I'm not even sure the junkyard will take it for anything much more than scrap. That's what you're dealing with here in this high technology area. So my thought would be, how much is our debt service going to be if we close it down today and we walk the other path to deal with the lawsuits that come our way? I think right now we probably need another $1 billion on top of what we spent to get these things looped. I understand these companies don't want to tie these things together, because if they do, we might start selling them off, and that causes a problem to those who have their money tied up in this thing. So I guess my bottom line question is, if we cut bait next week, what would we need in a debt service so we know what we're facing in future obligations? I think to continue on with this jeopardizes expansion of Medicare, jeopardizes our pension system, jeopardizes salaries for teachers, everything down the line. And it's very likely, if this thing got completed in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, new technology is going to come in and wipe it out by pricing structures.
And Senator, although we can't give you an exact,
I know.
exact,
Just an
but now I will say we did look at at that in the big picture, and we basically figured if you just shut it all down, assuming that it would never go live,
yes,
then you would save about $1 billion.
I think you're exactly right. I agree. Yeah, and I think if we keep it running, we may need to put that $1 billion plus another $1 billion in it. And what have we got? I think when it's up and running and completed, you couldn't give it away, is my personal opinion. We would have to pay someone like AT&T or Windstream or someone to be like a third-party administrator to keep it open. great and good thing about the fiber optics is they're wonderful. They are the way to go today, but they may not be 3 or 4 years from now. And I drive through East Kentucky, and about every other mile, there's a backhoe sitting in someone's front yard, and they're digging. And you're going to hit these fiber optics left and right. Could you keep it operational? I don't know. If we cut it in East Kentucky, does it shut things down in Northern Kentucky? And you know, if you've ever been on a job site where they fixed fiber optic, they don't just go down in that hole and patch it up there. They have to go to certain interconnect areas, which may be a mile or two away, and it's extremely expensive. So just if you could give us some notation in the future on what you think our debt service would be. Now, I know that can't include the lawsuits because we don't know where they're coming from, but we may be better off to see. But I think we'll find out that this system is so unconnectable in the future and right now that no communication company will touch it. And I don't think it will ever be a benefit that it will raise enough money to debt service itself. I think this is one of these things we're stuck in for 30 years. Thank you.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I would just say that we probably shouldn't have Senator Buford do the commercial to try to sell this off.
Senator West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't intend to ask any more questions, but this is a rich topic and
yes.
very, very important topic to the future of the Commonwealth. And as Senator Thomas said, this is so important for us from a economic development standpoint to be connected to the web anymore. So, but I couldn't resist coming back to Macquarie's current status. Did that they? Let me try to get this straight.
Sure.
Did they assign their interest in the initial contract as far as it goes to construction?
I think that's correct, Josh. Is that?
They are still in some manner an owner of the operations company that is supposed to be overseeing the construction of the project.
Okay.
But their stance would be that as Chris alluded to earlier, the Macquarie company at a high level is no longer involved, and so any questions or concerns need to go to this local entity that
Right.
they are a part owner of.
So, and that leads to my second question, which is, so in essence, they've assigned or sold their interest in the entity when it comes to the construction process, which is actually the responsibility part, but they've retained their interest when it comes to the revenue part. Is that?
That's the assignment. I get to use this wonderful chart over here.
Okay. Yeah, gotcha. I couldn't keep up.
That's the assignment you're referring to happened. Here is the Commonwealth agreement originally with Macquarie, and then that arrow ends. It doesn't go down here to construction and operations because there is an assignment of those obligations, and that assignment runs to Open Fiber and others. And so instead of Macquarie being the key piece of all this, we have Quick, the Commonwealth-created entity, and then Quack, which is a Macquarie-affiliated company.
Gotcha. So when my idea of a P3, I think, and the general idea that the public has is that private entity has skin in the game, right? They come to the table with capital, expertise, etc. What skin in the game did Macquarie bring to this transaction? How much money, let me clarify, how much money have they put in so far to this endeavor?
I think we looked.
They would
like four.
I think to this point, roughly, it's $4.2 million in equity is what they've put in, and that's all private partners. That's not just Macquarie.
And Senator, if I could make just a quick comment, a perfect example of from a government standpoint, a good P3 was the Indiana toll roads. As I understand, the state made, Josh, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but made several $1 billion. The project didn't quite work out, and Macquarie actually lost several $1 billion, but it wasn't several $1 billion that was lost to the Commonwealth or to that, to that particular state. And so that's really, if the private sector wants to make the money, then they need to take the risk.
Correct. And I think I partially knew the answer to my own question before I started, but I think somewhere in this report I read that the initial projection was that they would put in $6 million hard cash, hard money into the project. And I think I read somewhere in here where it said that $6 million hasn't even been drawn down yet. So if you really look at it, they put in zero.
I think they're equating their services they provide.
Yes, what hasn't been drawn down yet? There is a portion of the debt to finance the project. That would be that would be their argument. That would be another element that they would say they've contributed that will have to
capital dollars that they've put in.
$4.2 million. That has happened.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
that has happened.
But I think even the drawdown, they have a guaranteed rate of return, don't they?
Right. I mean, the expectation will be if
so they're going to get their $4.2 million paid back. Could that get paid back with supervening event payments?
No.
That goes to the separate contractors.
The repayment of that equity contribution is part of the AP payment schedule, and so it's part of the 30 years worth of payments. And that 6.5, once it's fully contributed, will earn 10.2% interest compounded annually for 30 years. And I think it would be helpful for the committee. We can send to committee staff an explanation of Quock's equity owners and how that ownership breaks down. It is a consortium of different entities, mostly represented by LLCs. Quock itself is a limited liability corporation doing business here in Kentucky. I will note that through the project agreement, Quick transferred all of its responsibilities to Quock to build and maintain the network. Quock then transferred its construction responsibility to NGKIH, which is the design builder. You could think of that as the construction subcontractor. And then they transferred their service responsibilities for the maintenance of the network for 30 years to another entity, which we call the service provider. However, the fact that they assigned their responsibilities through subordinated contracts to other entities does not relieve Quock ultimately of its responsibility to build this network for Kentucky or maintain it for 30 years. So, there's a cascading layer of contracts, but nothing relieves Quock ultimately of its responsibility, and thus nothing relieves Quock's owners of their responsibility as equity investors in Quock to build this network for the state.
Thank you for the clarification. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to ask. I told myself that I was not going to pose any more questions on this project. I mean, it's pretty sad. I think it's very good that we're talking about it, Mr. Chair, only in the sense that it's been in doing this post-mortem, it really shows the limitation of government, and that perhaps we should stick to things that we typically should do as government. I mean, this is obvious something that the private sector should have had a large hand on. We don't have the expertise. But my question relates to the series of contracts. I don't know if we can anticipate a committee to oversee a series of events like this, but we do have a subcommittee. It's contract review. And of all the contracts that we see on this board, I'm curious if any of these contracts had to go through the committee, and if not, why?
I think that's a good question. I think it was scheduled to go before the committee that was canceled for that particular week.
Correct.
So maybe we need to look at make that not an option in the future, that it must be heard by that committee rather than just.
Well, I would go a little bit further, especially if something this magnitude, not only should it have to be heard, I think the General Assembly should have at least, some final approval in that regards of this magnitude. And I think the P3, as I said, the P3 legislation that's currently in place, which, it doesn't go fully in place until 2020, it does have a $25 million cap. Anything more than $25 million does have to be approved by the General Assembly.
And secondly, if I might continue, most contracts, particularly agreements like this, it's a provision typically saying the agreements cannot be assigned unless agreed by the parties. Looking at all these assignments that we've walked in all these entities I've never heard of, is there any protections for the Commonwealth to kind of oversee and actually approve those in the master agreement?
Well, I mean, are you asking, are there currently any protections, or is there?
are there provisions in the contract that basically sets forth that none of the agreements stemming from the master agreement can be assigned to another entity without the Commonwealth's approval?
Let me ask.
I don't recall seeing that in the agreements. I can go back and look, but I do know there's a finance policy under which this was assigned, where I believe here the parties agreed to the assignment, which one of those parties being the Commonwealth through the finance cabinet. So that's how the assignment took place here.
Okay. Mr. Chair, we might, I mean, this post-mortem is, once again, is a very worthwhile endeavor to ensure that this is not going to crop up, probably not in this type of situation with KentuckyWired, but in any type of endeavor, we probably need to create buffers to adequately protect taxpayers. And that's the sad thing about it is we talk about this, and we've talked about it for several months. We all know it's a bad deal, and it's easy. 2020, hindsight's 2020. But the sad part is the Kentucky taxpayers who are going to bear the brunt of this fiasco. So hopefully, if nothing else can come out of it, Mr. Chair, we can think in terms of trying to develop policies to preclude us, to protect us from endeavors like this. And one last comment, you know, I'm not a fan of public-private partnerships. I think they are very good in theory, in its purest sense, but we have to come to a realization that in many instances it's not a fair transaction. My good friend Auditor Harmon, I disagree. I think the Indiana Turnpike deal was a horrible deal. They did get money, but once again, governments typically, we don't have the sophistication to actually sit across the table with these large developers and their multiplicity of attorneys. We have to be wary of this in the future, or we're going to find ourselves in similar situations. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Representative Simpson. And I think we will close out the questioning with Co-Chair Beckler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two comments. Number one, since Senator Thomas mentioned me in his question, and he left, that's just not right. I just wanted to make it clear that in my comment about my belief that we ought to kill the project, I was not implying, nor do I believe, that we should default on the bonds. I was talking about the project per se, not the bonds. And secondly, Mr. Brown, since you brought up the 10.2% interest, I have a comment there. I don't know any financial institution that was given 10.2% interest back when this contract was signed. So I really question, I get back to Representative Koenig's, and I know I mentioned you, three possible reasons. But the other point that I want to make on that is that typically it's my understanding that if you're getting compounded interest, you get that interest at the end of the term. And what I believe we're doing is paying it, did you say quarterly or?
It's annual.
All right, we're paying it annually, and the payment will end up being what it would be if we paid at the end of the term. So they're getting more, once we pay the interest, the compounding ought to go down, or the principal, and what they have should go down. So this is another instance where we being the Commonwealth, have made just a horrible, horrible decision, and I do believe the project, with the exception of paying the bonds, should be killed. You and I have had this discussion, and I know we disagree, but I haven't changed my mind. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in this, for your testimony today. I found it very enlightening, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me speak.
Okay, I want to make sure everyone is aware that the report that we've been referring to is available online under the Program Review Meeting Materials Directory. And I, too, Auditor Harmon, thank you. Staff, thank you for being here. Philip, thank you. Again, appreciate the job you do. You are in a no-win situation, my friend. And I want to just make a general statement to, as Co-Chair Beckler stated many times, to assure the public we are going to get to the bottom of this, and this is transparency is going to be brought to this entire process from day one. And speaking for this committee, that's what we are here for. We have the tools available to make sure that that happens, and our intention is to do that. And Auditor Harmon, thank you for your efforts and staff. I think it's gone a long way to help us understand the magnitude of the poor, and I will be nice, the poor decisions that were made with this entire project. Maybe well-meaning in the beginning, but very poorly executed and very poor foresight and what the results, the ramifications of the decisions that were made, and unfortunately, as everyone has said, the taxpayers are stuck with it. Finally, just remind the committee that our next meeting is on November the 8th, and if there are no other questions or comments, I will, yes, sir. Representative Rothenberg.
Mr. Chair,